She was 34 years old when she buried her husband, and 34 years and 6 weeks old when his own brother put her out into the road with a carpet bag and $11 to her name. That brother was Cyrus Ainsley, a man who had smiled at her wedding and signed his name to her ruin, claiming the family store had never truly belonged to his brother at all, only to the estate, and the estate, by some paper trick only a banker could love, belonged now to him. With those $11 pressed flat in her glove, she heard that the county was selling off an abandoned blacksmith's cabin at the dry edge of Solace Flat, a place folks had shunned for 15 years, since the smith who built it vanished without a word. And she paid 9 of her last dollars for it, drawing pitying looks from men who called it a fool's purchase, a haunted shack not worth the nails in its door. What she did not know, what no one in that dust-blown Arizona Territory town could have told her, was that beneath the smith's old workbench sat a locked iron box that no hammer, no chisel, no crowbar could force open, and that whatever slept inside it had been waiting 15 patient years to save not just one woman, but an entire forgotten town. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Ainsley. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, a town or a home or a season of your life that everyone else walked away from, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Clara had not always been a woman who counted coins in a glove. She was born Clara Voss in 1854, in a river town in Missouri, the third of 4 children and the only daughter of a farrier named Aldous Voss, a broad, quiet man, whose hands were so scarred by forge burn that strangers sometimes stared, and so gentle that the wildest horses in the county would stand still under them without a rope. Her mother had died, bringing her 4th child into the world, a boy who did not survive the winter that followed, and so Clara grew up in a house of men, in the ringing, sulfur-smelling world of her father's smithy, where the work never stopped, and there was no one to tell a girl that iron and fire were not hers to touch. Her brothers went off to apprentice as wheelwrights and carpenters as soon as they were old enough, drawn by wages, in town. But Clara stayed, because she loved it, because the forge was the only place she had ever felt entirely certain of herself. Her father did not teach her out of some grand notion of equality. He taught her because there was work to be done, and a pair of hands willing to do it. And if those hands happened to belong to his daughter, so much the better. She learned to read the color of hot iron the way other girls learned embroidery stitches, the dull cherry red of iron not yet ready, the bright orange of iron eager to be shaped, the pale straw yellow of steel at the very edge of its temper, past which it would either take an edge that could shave a hair or shatter like glass. She learned that a lock, at its heart, was only a small machine built by someone patient enough to make it, and that patience, more than strength, was what actually bent metal to a person's will. Her father used to say, striking the anvil for emphasis, that most people looked at a piece of scrap iron and saw only what it used to be, never what it might become, and that the whole secret of his trade was refusing to believe that anything was finished being useful until you had tried the fire on it at least once. Clara carried that sentence with her for the rest of her life without knowing, in her youth, how literally she would one day need it. When she was 22, a soft-spoken land surveyor named Daniel Ainsley came through her father's town on his way west, needing a wagon wheel mended, and stayed 3 days longer than the repair required because he could not stop finding reasons to talk with the farrier's daughter, who knew more about tempering steel than he did about anything at all. They married within the year, and when Daniel took a position managing a dry goods store in the Arizona Territory for his older brother Cyrus, who had gone out earlier, and established himself as a man of some standing in the growing settlement of Solace Flat, Clara went with him gladly, believing, as young wives often do, that love and competence together were a kind of armor against whatever the world might do to them. For 11 years, that belief held. She kept the store's ledgers more honestly than Cyrus ever had, mended harness leather and small tools for neighbors who could not afford the blacksmith in town, and became known, quietly, as a woman whose word and whose handiwork could both be trusted absolutely. She and Daniel never had children, a private sorrow they carried together without ever quite naming it aloud, but they had each other, and they had the store, and they had, Clara believed, a future that did not depend on anyone's charity. She did not yet know how thin the difference could be between being trusted and being merely tolerated, nor how quickly a woman without a husband could become, in the eyes of men like Cyrus Ainsley, a liability to be quietly removed rather than a person to be honored. The fever came through Solace Flat in the late summer of 1887, the kind that moved from the mining camps down through the wash whenever the water ran low and stagnant, and it took Daniel, in 11 days, strong and steady 1 week and gone the next, leaving Clara alone in a town that had only ever loved her through him. She grieved, as anyone would grieve, in the raw, disbelieving way of a person whose whole daily architecture has been knocked down overnight, and she might have found her footing again in time, had Cyrus Ainsley not moved with such cold and practiced speed. Within a month of the burial, he called Clara into the very store she had kept honest for over a decade and informed her, with a lawyer's letter already drawn up and a clerk from the county seat already waiting outside, that the store and the small house behind it had never been Daniel's to leave her, that they belonged to the Ainsley family estate, of which Cyrus was sole administrator, and that certain debts against the business, debts Clara had never once seen recorded in her own careful books, required the property to be sold to satisfy creditors. She asked, with a calm that cost her everything she had left, to see those debts in writing, and Cyrus told her, not unkindly, that grief made women see conspiracies where there were only unfortunate facts, and that she would do better to accept his generosity in giving her time to pack before the new tenants arrived. The town, which had smiled at her for 11 years, mostly looked away. A few of the women brought food in the first days, murmuring sympathy, but sympathy has a short season in a hard country, and by the time Clara stood in the road with her carpetbag, most of Solace Flat had already decided that whatever had happened between the Ainsley brothers was a family matter best left alone. She was 34, widowed, publicly declared without property or income, and she had exactly $11 sewn into the lining of her one good glove, money she had saved a coin at a time, from small mending jobs Cyrus had never known about, because some instinct, some old lesson from her father's forge about always keeping a little iron in reserve, had told her not to trust her whole future to any single hand, even a husband's. She spent 2 of those dollars on a room above the Mercantile for a week, while she considered her situation, and it was there, listening to 2 freighters talk in the yard below her window, that she first heard about the old blacksmith's cabin the county was finally selling off for back taxes, a place at the far dusty edge of town that no one wanted because of the strange business of the smith who used to live there. The freighters called it Dunmore's Folly, after the blacksmith Ezra Dunmore, who had set up his forge at the edge of Solace Flat sometime around 1870, and had, by all accounts, been the finest ironworker anyone in that stretch of the territory had ever seen, capable of shoeing a horse so evenly that it never favored a hoof again, of mending a broken plow so that it outlasted 2 more besides. And then, one night in the autumn of 1873, Ezra Dunmore had simply vanished, leaving his forge cold and his tools scattered, and the town, never comfortable with a mystery it could not resolve, had decided over the years that he must have been a thief, or worse, running from some crime back east, and had let his cabin sit and rot at the edge of the wash, while the wind pushed sand up against its door. When the county clerk, a tired, honest man named Fenwick Pruitt, offered the property at auction for unpaid taxes, not a single soul in Solace Flat bid on it, and Clara, with her 9 remaining dollars and nowhere else in the world to put them, raised her hand and bought a dead man's cabin nobody wanted for the price of a decent dress. Fenwick handed her the deed with something like pity in his eyes, and told her, not unkindly, that she'd have been wiser to keep her money for the stage fare back east, and Clara, walking the 2 dusty miles out to see what she had purchased, privately wondered if he was right. The cabin, when she reached it, was smaller and stranger than she had imagined. A low structure of adobe brick and rough timber, built hard against a shoulder of red rock, with the collapsed lean-to of a forge attached to its western wall, and a chimney of stacked stone that had somehow survived a decade and a half of desert weather, standing straight and true. Inside, the dust lay thick over everything. A fine gray blanket over a cot, a table, a scatter of tools rusted into brittle orange lace, But Clara found herself moving through the wreckage with a strange and growing tenderness, because she recognized, in the arrangement of that forge and the wear patterns on those tools, the handwriting of someone who had loved his work as much as her own father had. The anvil was set at exactly the right height for a man of middling stature. The tongs were racked by size, largest to smallest, precisely as her father had always insisted. Whoever Ezra Dunmore had been, whatever crime the town had invented for him in the vacuum of his absence, he had been, in the specific and unmistakable language of tools kept with care, a craftsman of real seriousness, and Clara felt the first true stirring of purpose she had known since Daniel's death, a sense that she had not merely bought a shelter, but had stepped, uninvited, into the unfinished middle of someone else's story. She spent that first evening simply clearing space enough to sleep, sweeping the cot, and beating the worst of the dust from a moth-eaten blanket she found folded at its foot. And it was only the next morning, while dragging the heavy oak workbench away from the wall to make room for a stove she meant to salvage from the ruined forge, that her boot caught against something fixed to the underside of the bench, something that did not shift or splinter the way old wood should, and she knelt down into the cool shadow beneath the workbench to see what it was. It was an iron box, roughly the size of a large family Bible, bolted with heavy iron straps to the underside of the bench so securely that whoever had placed it there had clearly never intended it to be found by casual clearing, only by someone determined enough to look beneath the bench at all. Its surface was pitted with rust, but the hasp and lock were of a different, darker metal entirely. Some alloy Clara did not recognize, tempered to a hardness that made her father's old tools look soft by comparison. And there was no keyhole in the ordinary sense, only a small round plate set into the lock's face, stamped with a symbol she did not know, a circle crossed by what looked like a single flame. She worked the box free from the bench that same afternoon with a borrowed pry bar from the livery, carrying it back to the cabin, cradled against her chest like something alive. And that night, by the light of a single candle, she tried everything a desperate and curious woman might try. She struck the lock with a rock. She tried to lever the hasp with a fire iron until her palms blistered. She even, in a moment of pure frustration, threw the whole box against the cabin's stone hearth, and it bounced off without so much as a scratch to show for the impact, ringing with a low, deep, almost musical note that seemed entirely wrong for a piece of rusted junk metal, a note that lingered in the small room far longer than it should have. Whatever was locked inside that box, Clara understood by midnight, had been made by someone who understood iron every bit as well as she did, perhaps better, and it would not surrender to force. It would have to be reasoned with, the way her father had always insisted a stubborn piece of metal must be reasoned with, on its own terms, in its own language. And Clara realized with a chill that ran clean through her tiredness that she was very likely the only person for 100 miles who still spoke that language at all. She did not open the box that first week, nor the second, though she thought of little else while she scrubbed the cabin livable and traded mending work in town for flour and coffee, careful not to let anyone in Solace Flat know exactly what she had found beneath that bench. It was while restoring the ruined forge itself, clearing the flue and rebuilding the collapsed portion of the firebox with brick she salvaged from the old chimney, that she discovered the second piece of the puzzle, tucked into a shallow drawer built into the side of the workbench, so cunningly that it took her 3 days of living alongside the thing before her fingers found the catch. Inside lay a bundle of papers wrapped in oiled cloth, and by candlelight that night, Clara read the private words of a man the whole town had spent 15 years condemning as a thief. The papers were pages from Ezra Dunmore's own journal, and what they described, in the cramped, careful hand of someone accustomed to precision, was not a criminal fleeing justice, but a frightened man protecting a discovery he had come to believe would destroy him if the wrong person learned of it. Ezra wrote of finding, some years after settling at the edge of Solace Flat, a spring behind the shoulder of red rock against which his cabin was built, a spring that ran cold and sweet and, crucially, never once failed even in the driest months of the worst droughts, at a time when every other source of water for miles around had a habit of disappearing precisely when the town needed it most. He wrote of testing the water for a full year in secret, before he trusted it, of filing, quietly and through a lawyer in the county seat, rather than through any local official, a formal water claim in his own name, meaning to reveal it to the town in time, once he was certain it was real and durable and not some trick of an unusually wet season. And he wrote, in an entry dated only weeks before his disappearance, of a growing dread that Silas Bragg, the founder and most powerful man in Solace Flat, had somehow learned of the spring and meant to seize the claim for himself, because for 50 miles could control, in effect, everyone who depended on it. Clara read that last entry 3 times before she set the pages down, her hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the desert cold coming through the cabin's thin walls. Silas Bragg had been dead for over a decade now, but his name was still spoken with a kind of reverence in Solace Flat, mostly because his grandson, Emmett Bragg, had inherited both the family's banking interests and its habit of quietly owning a piece of nearly everything in town, including, Clara now realized with a sinking understanding, the note on the very cabin she had just purchased, which the county clerk had mentioned only in passing as having been held for years by the Bragg family before falling into tax default. She understood now, reading between Ezra's careful, frightened lines, why a skilled and respected craftsman would vanish overnight rather than face a man like Silas Bragg with proof that threatened his control of the town's water. The final journal entry, dated the night before the last date Ezra Dunmore was ever seen, mentioned that he had secured the deed to the spring and certain notes concerning debts Bragg owed unpaid to half the merchants in Solace Flat, inside a box of his own forging, a box built with a lock that could only be opened by a very specific method known to a smith of real skill, because he trusted no ordinary lock to survive Bragg's determination, and he trusted, he wrote in his last legible line, that whoever eventually found it would know what to do with what it held, better than he had known what to do with the fear that had finally driven him from the only home he had wanted. The entries stopped there. Clara sat with that unfinished sentence for a long while, feeling the peculiar grief of mourning a man she had never met, and feeling, beneath the grief, the slow kindling of something that felt almost like purpose returning to her chest. Word travels quickly in a small desert town, and it was not many weeks before Solace Flat noticed that the widow everyone had written off was somehow managing, that her cabin had smoke rising steadily from its chimney, and her forge, impossibly, had begun to ring again in the mornings with the sound of hammer on iron, a sound the town had not heard from that particular direction in 15 years. Clara had begun, out of simple necessity, to take in small smithing jobs, a broken axle, a bent gate hinge, a cracked kettle, work she did with an ease that surprised customers who had assumed, wrongly, that a woman alone could only manage a household and never a forge, and slowly, grudgingly, a trickle of business found its way to her door, enough to keep her fed through that first hard winter. It was this small, stubborn success that first drew Emmett Bragg's attention, because Emmett Bragg noticed everyone's business, especially anyone gaining a foothold near land his family had once controlled, and when he learned that the Ainsley widow had bought Dunmore's old cabin outright and was making it pay, he rode out himself one gray morning to see what she was about. He was a tall, precisely groomed man, with the particular smoothness of someone who had never once had to raise his own voice to get what he wanted, and he offered Clara, with every appearance of neighborly generosity, to buy the cabin back from her at double what she had paid, citing concerns about a woman living alone so far from town, and hinting, delicately, that the property had a troubled history better left undisturbed. Clara, who had spent 15 nights now studying a Smith's journal by candlelight, felt the hair rise on her arms at his careless mention of the cabin's history, and she declined his offer with a politeness that cost her considerable effort, watching something flicker briefly behind his composed features before he rode away, promising, in a tone that did not sound entirely like a promise of goodwill, that he would check on her again soon. He did check again, and often, and as the months passed, his visits grew less neighborly and more pointed, until word reached Clara that Emmett had begun quietly telling merchants in town that the widow Ainsley was digging around in old Dunmore business best left buried, that there had always been something not quite right about that cabin and the man who built it, and perhaps, by association, about any woman foolish enough to make her home there. The whispers cost Clara customers, cost her the easy nods she had begun to earn back on the street, and she understood that Emmett was doing precisely what his grandfather had apparently done to Ezra Dunmore 15 years before, using rumor and quiet pressure rather than open confrontation, because a man like Bragg preferred to win his battles before anyone realized a battle was being fought at all. The true crisis came the following spring, when the worst drought in a generation settled over that stretch of the territory, drying the town's shallow wells to mud within weeks, and forcing ranchers and merchants alike to haul water at ruinous cost from the county seat, while Solace Flat's only deep well, conveniently, sat on land the Bragg Bank held the note on, allowing Emmett to raise the price of water access twice within a single month, a cruelty dressed up as simple economics. It was watching families she had known for years begin to talk of abandoning Solace Flat entirely, watching children go thin-faced and cattle go to bone, that Clara finally understood the true weight of what Ezra Dunmore had left buried beneath his workbench, and understood, too, that she could delay no longer in learning how to open it. She returned to her father's oldest lesson, the one about patience and fire and the true nature of a lock built by someone who trusted no ordinary key, and she began, night after night in the glow of her rebuilt forge, to experiment with the very thing Ezra's journal had hinted at but never stated outright, that his lock, forged from an alloy that expanded and contracted with heat far more dramatically than ordinary iron, might only yield, if brought with patient and exact craft, to precisely the temperature at which the metal itself would loosen its own grip. It took her 11 attempts across as many nights, ruining 2 pairs of tongs and scorching her forearm badly enough to leave a mark she would carry the rest of her life, before she found it, the narrow window of pale straw gold heat at which the strange dark alloy of that lock, and only that alloy, would soften just enough to release its internal mechanism, a temperature so specific and so brief in its usefulness that no thief working with brute force could ever have stumbled onto it by accident, only a smith patient enough to test the fire again and again the way her father had taught her to test everything. When the lock finally gave way with a soft, almost gentle click, dropping open in her careful tongs at the height of that one perfect moment of heat, Clara did not cry out or celebrate. She simply knelt there on the dirt floor of the forge, tears running clean tracks through the soot on her face, and lifted the lid on 15 years of a good man's careful, frightened hope. Inside, wrapped against the damp in the same oiled cloth as the journal pages, she found a formal deed, notarized and sealed by a county lawyer, granting Ezra Dunmore and his heirs the water rights to the spring behind his cabin, a deed whose legal standing had never once been challenged, simply because no one had known to challenge it. Beneath the deed lay a ledger, meticulously kept in Ezra's same careful hand, listing debts Silas Bragg owed to 11 separate merchants and ranchers of Solace Flat, sums borrowed against the promise of the town's growth and never repaid, debts that predated and helped explain the very leverage the Bragg family had used ever since to tighten its grip on the town's water and credit alike. And at the very bottom, wrapped separately, a small pouch of gold dust, not a fortune, but enough, Clara understood at once, to matter greatly to a town currently paying ruinous prices simply to keep its throats from cracking with thirst. She did not act rashly, though every instinct in her wanted to march directly into Emmett Bragg's bank and lay the deed across his polished desk. Instead, she rode 2 days to the county seat and sat with a lawyer there, a careful older man named Josiah Trent, who had, coincidentally or not, been the very attorney Ezra Dunmore had once used to file his original claim, and who remembered, dimly but with growing certainty as Clara laid out her documents, the frightened, earnest blacksmith who had come to him 15 years before. Trent confirmed the deed's validity beyond any doubt Emmett Bragg could hope to raise, and helped Clara prepare a case not for personal enrichment, but for public restoration, because Clara had understood, sitting alone with that open box, that the true treasure Ezra Dunmore had left behind was never the water or the gold at all, but the chance to finally make right what his fear had left broken. She called a town meeting for the following Sunday, in the same dry goods store Cyrus Ainsley had once evicted her from, and stood before a skeptical, sunburned, thirsty crowd of her neighbors to lay the truth out plainly. The deed proving the spring behind her cabin belonged, by clear and undisputed law, to her, as Ezra's rightful successor in interest through the property's chain of title, the ledger proving exactly how much money the Bragg family had owed this town for 2 generations, and her own simple, unadorned promise that she intended to open that spring to every family in Solace Flat, free of charge, for as long as she lived, because water, unlike land or gold, was never meant to belong to any single hand. Emmett Bragg, present in that room with his face gone the color of old ash, tried at first to challenge the deed's authenticity, then tried to suggest Clara had forged the documents herself, but Josiah Trent's calm, county seat testimony and the plain, undeniable weight of Ezra's own careful ledger, cross-checked that same week against the actual account books of the very merchants he had cheated, left him nothing solid to stand on. Within a month, facing demands for repayment from creditors who finally understood the debts owed them, and, with his bank's own reputation, crumbling under the town's collective realization of exactly what his family had done to a good man 15 years before, Emmett Bragg quietly sold his remaining holdings in Solace Flat and left the territory altogether, not driven out by violence or vengeance, but simply by the slow, sufficient justice of the truth finally being known. Clara used what remained of the gold dust, along with fair payment for water rights the town formally and gratefully arranged with her, not to build herself a grand house, or to leave that dusty corner of the territory behind, but to help repair the very wells and irrigation ditches Bragg's neglect had let crumble, and to erect, at the mouth of the spring itself, a modest stone marker bearing Ezra Dunmore's name and the plain truth of what he had discovered and protected at such cost to himself. She kept the forge running, kept the cabin as her home, and became, in time, the very thing her father had once been to her, a person whose hands the whole town learned to trust completely, not because she demanded it, but because she had proven, in the oldest and most patient way there was, that she deserved it. And so we return to where we began, to a 34-year-old widow standing in a dusty road with $11 in her glove and nothing else in the world, buying a dead man's cabin because it was the only door left open to her. It would have been easy, looking at that scene, to call it the lowest point of a ruined life, and easier still, as the town of Solace Flat once did, to see only what a thing used to be. An abandoned forge, a foolish purchase, a woman with nothing, rather than what it might yet become. But Clara Ainsley had learned long ago at her father's side that nothing is finished being useful until you have tried the fire on it at least once, and she carried that lesson through her grief, through her exile, through 15 years of a stranger's careful fear, until the very thing everyone else had walked away from became the instrument of an entire community's restoration. The locked box under that workbench had waited so long, not because no one was strong enough to open it, but because it was waiting for someone patient enough, someone who understood that the hardest locks in this life rarely yield to force, only to the slow, careful, faithful application of exactly the right kind of heat. We're grateful you spent this time with Clara's story, and if it moved you even a little, we'd love it if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that nothing forgotten is ever truly worthless. Before you go, we'd like to ask you something we think about often ourselves. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and we'll be sitting right here waiting to hear it. Until next time, stay close.